Okay, everybody, I can hear a great level of buzz in the room. So I conclude from that everyone's had some great lunch, some great conversations, and some great presentations. So what we're going to do now is essentially the maritime industry's equivalent of Britain's Got Talent or American Idol. I'm going to ask all of the groups to come up. There's going to be a first round and a second round. And they're going to briefly talk about the key themes that they have discussed in their groups. There's not going to be any voting. We're not going to have a bake-off and send them off one by one if they perform badly. Although if you want to go back to Roman gladiator style, you can start putting your thumbs down and booing. But the idea is basically to try and get a sense of understanding about some of the key issues, and above all else, to try and work towards some tangible steps that the industry can collectively take to actually implement some of the themes you've talked about. So can we have the heads of the decarbonization group, group 3, group 4, ship recycling, sustainable ocean, 2020 sulphur cap, industry collaboration, sustainability and profitability, and the talent and diversity seafarers groups all come up on stage, and we'll do a circle. I say this really does feel a bit like a sort of Oprah Winfrey sharing session, doesn't it? Where we can start talking about some of the key themes. But we've grouped these two groups together because the first lot are essentially looking at some of the key questions to do with how the industry engages with the wider world over issues such as the environment, sustainability, etc. And I'd like to start with Group 17, the Sustainability and Profitability Group, to say a few words about what your key points that you want to feed back to the rest of the group are about. So who was Group 17? Great. Do you want to stand up? We have the microphone there.
Thank you, Gillian. I'm Jeff Prebor. I'm the CFO of International Seaways. It's a relatively new company that is in the tanker transportation business. So that's where we fit in. So we're a shipping company. And I felt it was important to talk about sustainability and profitability going together because, first of all, it defines sustainability. It's a bit of a buzzword. I really don't even like it, but I think we should embrace it. It's convenient to use one word to mean environmentally friendly, diverse in our workforce, transparent in our governance, good to our employees, doing good as much as we can. But how can that be consistent with being profitable? I mean, can I be frank with you? I mean, some of you work for agencies or the media, but a lot of us are business people, and sustainability is all nice and well and good, but we have businesses to run. And I would say a couple of years ago, if you tried to talk about sustainability and profitability in the same sentence, you would be doing it with your fingers crossed. You just wouldn't believe it's possible. But can I tell you a story about a TV show in America called Billions? It's about a hedge fund. Some of you have probably seen it. At one point, one of the people in the hedge fund is pitching socially responsible investing, now called impact investing, to a potential investor, a billionaire, who said, I know you're saying, I'll just get a few percentage points less, but I'll do good for the world. And the hedge fund person pitching said, that is so 2 years ago. Now you're going to invest with me, you're going to do better for the world, and you're going to make more money. So that is where we are in the investing world. Is it where we are in the maritime cluster? There's still a lot of skeptics out there, but our group explored how we can have our goal. Where's my chart to remind me? Sustainability. Our goal is to have sustainability and profitability, meaning value creation, coexist for all stakeholders, by which I mean not just investors, public or private, but stakeholders like employees, vendors. The environment is a stakeholder. We will do well for all of them, promoting both sustainability and profitability. Well, how do we do that? What actions can we take? Speaking for shipping companies first, we should, and it's on the board, take actions like clearly articulate what our standards are with respect to emissions, 2020, 2050. Efficiency in how we run our ships to burn less fuel. Recycling, what's our commitment to green recycling? and not just any old recycling, which has environmental and labor impacts both. Speaking of labor, our employees, what are we doing to retain our employees, to nurture them, to help them be excited about working for us, but help them to retire very happily after many years of being a seafarer, let's say. And diversity in the workplace, very important. And what's our articulation to those goals? Okay, but if I said, let's just do that as a shipping company, unilaterally, it'll benefit sustainability, but it might cost us more. So why? How can I responsibly say, especially as a public company, we should take all these steps that differentiate us, but maybe cost more? Why would we do that? Because other participants in the shipping industry are going to get on board too. It's the banks. You heard this morning about, or some of you did, about the Poseidon principles. Banks saying we will only lend more freely to those who are committed to emission standards. Banks also say we're not going to lend unless you are committed to a recycling standard. So banks can help us. Insurance companies or insurance collaboratives like the P&I clubs, companies that are committed to sustainability will have lower incidents, or at least they'll be, I would contend, a high likelihood to have lower incidents and better safety record if you're committed to sustainability. So we can get lower insurance rates. On the equity side, we all know about the BlackRock Larry Fink letter, where BlackRock says he won't invest in companies, or BlackRock won't invest in companies unless they're committed to sustainability. The Norwegian fund, just to name two, there's many more. Norwegian fund says, we're committed to sustainability in our investments, so we only will invest in companies that do that. Therefore, if we take those steps, they may cost us a little bit, but we'll get it back in terms of greater profitability because we'll get cheaper access to capital. We'll get a higher PE or NAV ratio from the equity markets if we're public. We'll get cheaper insurance. And customers should use us first. Am I taking too much time, so you want me to wrap it up?
You've just about wrapped up, yeah.
Okay, I'll wrap it up. So if we do this, and we have leaders in the shipping community, the banking community, the insurance community, we can be the maritime sustainability profitability tribe. We'll be the first out there. We'll be the cool guys. And the last thing on our board is reward the good guys. We firmly believe we're at a point where sustainability can be rewarded with greater profits.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you, Jeff. I went with you first because you laid a great overview of what we're going to talk about in some of the drill down groups now. I realized I didn't actually stipulate how long you have. So you got extra minutes, okay? You were lucky because you went first. That's your reward for going first. The rest of you, can you try and keep it to 3 minutes? And I have a stopwatch. I'm going to wave it at you if you go beyond that. So after hearing the big picture, sustainability and profitability, let's hear about industry collaboration, because that's obviously one key element of that. Who is that? Oh, okay.
Okay, we spent a lot of time talking about addressing how to mobilize the shipping industry to meet the IMO 2050 carbon decarbonization goals. And shipping has a lot of industry collaboration experience. We felt that it was necessary to form a new organization that had the momentum, the positive momentum from the Global Maritime Forum, from the call to action that the CEOs have signed, and essentially drive forth a structure that would give a very transparent path, a roadmap, if you will, to provide alternative fuels, such as biofuels, ammonia, and the like, that would be compliant with IMO targets. But more importantly, give visibility to alternative propulsion systems that would be absolutely necessary to fulfill the 2050 goals. Because I think whether you're a ship owner or some other stakeholder, one of the biggest challenges of the IMO goal is not just that it's very aggressive, but that we have no idea whether or not there is technology available at commercially viable terms to fulfill those goals. And so we talked about a lot of different things, but basically that there need to be a source of funding that goes into R&D. And that funding needs to be collected. There have been proposals, such as a levy, if you will. But it isn't even enough that we agree that the IMO legislates a very transparent and very clear pathway to having the beneficial cargo owners pay for that funding. It's not enough that owners pay for it or operators pay for it. It needs to be directly tied to a carbon adjustment factor, if you will, that's on a TU mile, ton mile basis, so that not only the shipping industry is involved, but the general public is also directly involved in solving this problem. But there is a timing issue. The big challenge is, once again, we don't have any transparency or the roadmap going forward. So one of the big ideas that we had is, how do we bring in a third party, be it IMF, World Bank, AIBB, who can essentially forward fund the R&D that is required, or the deployment credits that are required to incentivize the proper amount of adoption so that vessels can comply with these IMO goals as soon as possible. So that's essentially where we're at. It's very connected to the decarbonization initiative, so thank you.
Well, that is fantastic. And you came in at 2 minutes 31, so that's even more fantastic. Well done. Well, moving forward onto the next one, we can talk about sulphur caps, because that's obviously linked to the IMO side. Let's do sulphur and then decarbonization.
Okay, so we started out with how do we identify, how do we create a level playing field for those folks that have invested in scrubbers, and to make sure that there wasn't an economic incentive there, and that we can achieve the environmental objectives of folks that have put scrubbers on board. So we talked about the compliance, what's the monitoring, how do you deal with the technology side of it. I think this is something that is unsolved. How do you deal with involuntary compliance? What's the notification? Do you deal with self-reporting? Is there a neutral body? We talked about different groups. We talked about GESIS, I think, from IMO. We talked about a clean room. And then how do you deal with the enforcement from the port states? Are there set fines? We looked at the Port of Singapore. I think they're exemplary in terms of what they've done, and should they lead the charge? Should we get a good populist movement in the industry to start to look at how you're going to create global standards around the industry? So we talked a little bit about that. So a number of different issues. What is the definition of non-compliance? Of course, we talked about the availability of fuels and all of that. The role of the supplier came in. Oh, good, I need the cheat sheet, thank you. The role of the supplier, and that was interesting. Certainly, ships that are not scrubbed, should be pretty obvious. So the bunker supplier, I think, should agree not to put, high sulfur fuel oil on those vessels. That's, I think, relatively easy. The whole notion of just compliance with testing of fuels on sulfur is relatively easy compared to, I think, the big issue, which is compatibility. Certainly, you've got lots of views on pricing. My own view is, things revert to norm after a while. So those were some of the issues that we talked about, and it was really engagement with a number of bodies, not just one side or the other. International Bunkering Industry Association was brought up. So there's more work that needs to be done. I think there's still not a lot that's being talked about the issue. We left it where the various groups that were there would look to assemble to create greater communication on this and clarity. But a big part of it was how do you get these independent port state entities to basically comply and deal with the enforcement and the compliance.
Right. Well, there's a lot of key themes there. A lot of key themes about collaboration and transparency and trying to draw up tangible steps to actually push that forward. Let's move to decarbonization. We have two groups looking at decarbonization. Which of you would like to go first? Do you want to jump in first?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hey.
Thank you. I'm Bryony Worthington, and I work for the Environmental Defence Fund. And our group really got into the detail of how you actually go about decarbonizing a sector, a global sector like the shipping industry. And we started to draw in parallels from other comparable size challenges. So shipping's emissions is around the same size as Germany's national emissions. And I choose Germany because Germany's been embarking on a couple of decades-long transition into a clean energy system. So that gives us some examples to draw from in terms of how you go about really bringing down the costs of new technologies. And on those shore-based examples, we've seen the cost curves of these technologies really coming down far faster than most people predicted, because economies of scale are bringing savings. So we were drawing through examples from previous successful systems. We saw obviously the goal needed to be smart, so we decided that a good test of progress would be that by 2030, zero emissions deep sea vessels were commercially viable. And once we set that challenge, that needs really to try and hit that 50% absolute reduction by 2050. You're going to see a significant number of these vessels on the water by 2030. So working back from that, we really need signals and policy frameworks and investment signals starting tomorrow, really. We've got to get going. It's going to be at least a decade, I think, proving out before this becomes really taken up on a big scale. But the good news is that if you take a technology neutral approach to this, there are a number of potential vectors to zero. And that can include new vessels entirely or drop-in substitutions of fuels into existing systems. So there's not going to be one silver bullet. And we can start work now on classifying those options that we'll need to see on the water in 2030, so that we as a sector become much more aware of where we're trying to get to, our options, and work out what the costs ultimately of those are going to be. So there are some near-term actions we can take working together, perhaps in joint ventures, working with the classification agencies to bring forward those zero vessel classifications for the deep sea market. In terms of how we're going to pay for this, we talked quite a bit about how raising the cost of pollution helps, because it means more of these technologies get caught into commercial viability, that you raise you move up the marginal abatement cost curve by introducing a carbon price. But more importantly, we also realized and talked a lot about how do we make that, how do we pump prime that whole process? How do we get money into the sector to pay for the early adopters and the people who are going to invest in the deployment of these technologies and these fuels that we know exist? And that really could be done through a self-financing fund that is administered by the sector. We felt it was quite important for many of the people in our discussion that the sector takes control of how this money is spent in order to then work out how to do it most efficiently and what works for the sector itself. So a fund could be created under the IMO. The IMO, I've said this before, you're very fortunate in having a sector-wide UN body dedicated to you and that you can use to set common standards, global transparent standards. So it can be a bit slow, we all know that, but it's up to all of you to speed that process up and get a policy that works for you. I think perhaps the experiences of the sulphur cap have taught you that if you don't do it, it'll get done to you. So get involved in the detail if you can. And so using that process, you can actually bring forward a self-financing mechanism that will bring in more investment, and you will then become customers of clean fuels and technologies, and your weight alone will mean that there'll be vendors there to meet your demand.
Right, and no, you were just about inside the time. We're going to go on to the vendors and the banks in a moment. Before we do, though, quickly, any price tag for how big that fund should be?
Well, there's lots of different ways of looking at it. We prefer to look at what volume of emissions you need to get on track. But just ballpark, $25 a ton of CO2 raises you $50 billion to spend on innovation and deployment. That's not going to break the bank. And obviously, we know that you're all hurting because of the sulfur costs, but relative to that, this is quite cheap. And you're buying a future free of all of this because you'll be a clean sector and you'll attract lots of great new talent to your sector. So try not to see it as a cost, but more of an investment.
Right. Well, you could take a vote as to whether the group here would accept a $50 billion a year fund, but maybe that is the way to go.
It's about the right value.
Yeah, interesting issue to debate. Well, let's, in that case, turn on to the decarbonization, the question of the financing and how the banks and vendors would look at this. Who is next up for the next decarbonization? Yeah. Stephen.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I'm Stephen Fewster. I'm Global Head of Shipping at ING Bank. My team, we manage a portfolio of about $10 billion financing the industry. We were asked to look at financing of decarbonisation, and given that there are quite a few bankers, there was a lot of talk about the bank's role. But actually, of course, it's not just down to the banks, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Thank you. So we set a goal, and the goal really was to encourage and assist the maritime industry to meet the Paris Agreement. And we felt that it was really two ways of doing that, obviously, carrots and sticks. And if we talk a little bit about the carrots, one of the things that we were thinking of is that the banks should be able to offer lower financing costs for green investments. And we see that the bank regulators should be able to allow us to allocate a lower level of capital on those green investments, because intrinsically the value should be higher. We would reflect in the loan documents some sticks. So currently, loan documents tend to have financial covenants, but we'd also look to include green covenants. So we would have to find a way of measuring your green credentials. And if you breach those, then I think you would expect that you would pay a higher rate of interest. One of the things we spoke about quite a lot is comparing shipping to aviation, and what we see in aviation is that they have a massive amount of data which is collected centrally. That's not true of shipping, and what we were suggesting is that the classification societies would require ships to submit data for each voyage in the same way as airlines do, and they would use that data to measure the polluting effect of a ship. And one of the ideas we had is that, similar to what we have in the UK for cars, the higher polluting cars pay more in tax, and we would suggest that the classification societies do something similar, and those tariffs could then be passed to the IMO to set up a development fund. So that's kind of the global coordination side. Who does this? Well, we feel that it's very important that we act as an industry and not individually. So we need the banks, the owners, port state control, class, IMO, etc., to all come together. Which kind of goes on to the next point, which is at the moment there are lots of different bodies all pursuing the same goals. And it's a very fragmented approach. So what we'd like to see is all of these different bodies coming together, probably under the Poseidon principles.
Right. Well, thank you. And you were exactly 3 minutes. Nothing like having a stopwatch. I can wave at you all, and you're all doing a fantastic job of sticking to time. Thank you. Well, that leaves two other panels on this particular part. Three: ship recycling, sustainable ocean, and the talent and diversity sectors. Which of you three feels that you are most naturally next in line? Okay, shall we do people and then do ship recycling and the ocean? And the stopwatch has started.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ian from V Group, and I celebrated my year anniversary in the industry yesterday. So it's been a pleasure for me meeting so many of you and working with you over the last couple of days. Now, whilst I'm new to shipping, I'm not new to big people businesses, so I was naturally drawn to the people discussion. And I should say there were two groups on this, and nobody at all went to the seafarers group, which says something, which is why we merged the two groups together. And I guess the problem we're trying to solve is how do we attract and retain and develop great new diverse populations of people into our industry. And if you want a statement of the problem, just look around the room. We are old, we are not at all diverse, and people was well down our agenda in terms of topics that we decided to talk about at this forum. And still, for some time to go, people will be very important to our businesses. We're not going to be automated just yet. So the problem we have is how do we attract young people into our industry? And our conclusion was we've got a pretty lousy value proposition right now. We don't really tell our story outside of this industry. People's perceptions are shaped by bad things, so they probably associate us with being disconnected from their families, working in dangerous environments, potentially getting arrested in strange parts of the world if they crash the ship, potentially getting involved in piracy incidents. We are not telling a great story. And we did, fortunately, found a young person yesterday in our group, and we asked him what he thought millennials were looking for, and he said they want a great working environment, they want flexibility, they don't like hierarchy, they want to wear what they want to work the hours they feel they want to work, and of course our industry is going to struggle with some of those things quite hard. So we said the first thing we need to do is find a vision. We need to have something compelling to tell our story. It's up there on the screen. So the words we came up with was something like connecting across the oceans responsibly for the future of our planet, and actually trying to tell the really great story that our industry has to tell about how we do connect the world, how we do promote trade, how we have helped to address many of the sustainability goals like reducing poverty and driving out inequality through the very actions of our industry. And as we've already discussed, we've actually got an increasingly good story to tell on decarbonization and looking after the planet. And those are some of the things that young people are really interested in. So we said, start there. We need a branding campaign to start telling that story. We felt the GMF was a great organization to maybe own that story and try to shape that branding campaign to start getting out there in a consistent way and saying why what we do is good and exciting and offers really interesting career prospects. And then ultimately, we've got to address our value proposition. We've got to go back to the millennials and offer them a value proposition that makes them excited about joining our industry. So that was our group. Thank you.
Thank you. That was terrific. And I must say, it's a terrifically wide range of themes, but very concrete range of ideas that have been putting forward. I must say, in terms of the conferences I've been to, this has to be one of the most tangible in terms of the discussions and debates that I've seen for a while. We have two more sectors. We have the recycling of ships, and we have the ocean, sustainable ocean. I think maybe recycling, and then...
You're talking about image issues. I think the one area of shipping that probably has the worst image is ship recycling. I've been in this business for about more than 2 decades. If ever I see a story in the paper about ship recycling, I would tell you 9 out of 10 times it's negative. It's negative pictures, it's been negative showing the people who are involved with this. As a result, what I've seen over the last, I've recycled about more than 3,500 ships over the years. What I've found is there is 2 groups of people. One that want to make a change and they want to participate aggressively. And the others who are saying, you know, this issue is too big for me. I don't want to get involved in it. I'll leave you guys alone. Do what you have to. I'm just going to dig my head in the sand and hope this problem goes away. I think this industry needs to come together and come with commonality of purpose. I'm not from the shipping industry. I never was. My background is in academia. I was a professor for a good 10 years, and I fell into this industry. Once I fell into this industry, none of us want to be in an industry that pollutes the oceans. None of us want to be in an industry that kills people. None of us want to do any of that. So what is going on? Then why do we have this problem? And one of these problems is a lack of communication, a lack of dialogue. People just don't want to address this issue. And the irony is, whether you're a ship manager, whether you're a ship owner, whether you're a capital provider, whether you're a cargo owner, whether you're a charter, whether you're a class society, whether you're a marine warranty surveyor, whether you're an underwriter, it affects you. It affects you. And the only time we see about is when somebody goes to prison. We now have criminalization of the whole ship recycling process, where people involved with this, marine warranty surveyors are being pressed charges against, and underwriters are being pressed charges against, bankers are getting negative publicity, owners are getting negative publicity. I think we don't need to do that. This industry is changing, it is evolving, the standards are improving, it is becoming, in fact, what we discussed in our group is, it's not just sustainable. We use the term responsible. What is responsible recycling? It's more than sustainable. It has to be profitable. We cannot be in an industry that just says we got to get money from someone. It has to be sustainable in that sense. And it has to be that take care of the big pillars. We came up with a lot of standards. The bottom line is we said by next year, 2019, We should be in this platform where owners, all these various constituents have come together and established what are the standards we're going to accept. So we can be proud and say, okay, is it the Hong Kong Convention? Is the EU regulation? Is that any other new regulation we come up with? But let's agree on a standard that we can all be proud of. So it's not something where we are the intermediaries in between, that we are not criticized for that. So that's my hope. When we come back next year, we'll be talking about ship recycling in a different way because it affects all of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, of course, one of the tangible things that's come out of this year's meeting is the decarbonisation letter, and maybe that can be taken as a model or a template for addressing issues like ship recycling for next year. But I'm going to finish with the ocean, sustainable ocean one, because it seems like a nice way to sum up a lot of these themes we've been talking about. So you have 3 minutes on the sustainable oceans.
So Paul Holtis from the World Ocean Council. So we are the organization that brings the shipping industry into contact with your peers in the other ocean industries, a business leadership alliance on sustainable ocean. And the first thing we did was make sure we're talking about ocean singular. It's one big global ocean. It's one big global ocean business community. And so what we focused on, there's a whole lot of things that could and should be worked on by that collective ocean industry community that includes you, but includes many other sectors who share that space, have many of the same challenges and issues you do, and so there's economies of scale, there's synergies that can be achieved by working on these issues across the sector. So we really focus on some action areas to move forward with the agenda. Some of the things that link to what we heard about from some of the other sectors, particularly the profitability and sustainability, and what we're hearing from the banks and the finance community is the need for metrics and a scorecard. So we're working, and the discussion today really re-emphasized this need to develop metrics and a scorecard using the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, as a framework for that, as a way to evaluate, and someone said the green credentials, to evaluate the green credentials, but not just of shipping industry operators, but those in the other ocean industries. So we've got a system across the board for all of the economic players in the ocean. Related to that, the investment side then, what are the kinds of things that need investment? So decarbonization, dealing with ship recycling, et cetera. What are the business opportunities in the sustainability challenges, the responsible performance challenges and opportunities that are here and emerging even more day by day in the various industries? And how can we create the return on getting involved with the right companies on dealing with those issues? A third specific action area that came out of this discussion that relates to the SDGs in particular is the opportunity for the shipping industry and other ocean industries to increase ocean knowledge to the benefit of shipping in terms of helping ensure that we've got the knowledge, the data that goes to the scientists, the modelers, the forecasters that help us understand what's going on in the ocean, in the Arctic and elsewhere, that increases the safety and responsible shipping and transport opportunities for industry. So you all can be, that have fleets, can be collecting data by hosting instrumentation on your vessels in what's known as ships of opportunity, or more broadly smart ocean and smart industries, and there's economies of scale in doing that. A couple of the other the program areas or action areas that we focused on to wrap this up, ocean governance. All of you are being held accountable not just to what happens at the IMO, but how the ocean overall is being managed. And this ocean governance is moving ahead in ways this year that it has never before. And this industry needs to be at the table. The law of the sea, which you all know, is now, which you may not know though, is now being worked on with a legally binding amendment for what's called biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. We, the World Ocean Council, have been there for years trying to help ensure there's an industry presence. The formal negotiations started a month ago at the UN. For the next 3 years or so, the rules for how the high seas are used are going to be determined by a group of governments that have a lot of input from a lot of other stakeholders. The shipping industry and the other ocean industries need to be there, and that's something we all need to work on over the next 3 years. The last point is on some specifics regarding these high priority issues of waste in the oceans and the role of the industry, the shipping industry, is on what happens at port. All of you need to be able to have the port reception facilities to make sure none of the waste from the shipping industry is getting into the ocean. And that's a key technical, operational area of activity for all of us to work on in the years to come, dealing with this high-profile issue of plastics and marine debris. So that's the sort of work we can all be doing together, bringing you into contact and in partnership with your peers and like-minded colleagues in other ocean industries. Thanks.
Well, thank you to all of you for both sticking to time and to presenting such a seamless, entirely unrehearsed series of ideas. I think gelled together very nicely in terms of a whole. And I can't stress strongly enough the fact that the decarbonisation letter was just released just now really indicates that this is not just a talking shop, that people are actually trying to turn this into tangible measures. Jeff said at the beginning that it's both about sustainability and profitability. You can't have one without the other. The theme of the first session has very much been about sustainability and how you're putting the industry on a healthier footing. We're now going to turn to the next set of panels, which is really looking at the business model of the industry and how you actually create the profitability effectively to support this. So I'm going to suggest that we give them all a round of applause again, and then the next lot come up. The next group come up, and we're going to be looking particularly at digitalization, I can't say it properly, data sharing. Data, of course, is at the center of a lot of the discussions about the sustainable measures, and we'll also be looking at the financing question, safety, regulations, and more digitalization. So this will hopefully show how the industries are going to become on a healthier business footing to support the wider sustainability issue. So let's start with, should we start with regulations and then move into the series of digitalizations? I think some of the digitalizations may have actually overlapped, but we'll start with regulations, the bit that no one wants to talk about.
I'm Scott Bergeron with the Liberian Registry. So the first thing to mention is that we found ourselves having to adopt innovation. It was a group that was somehow abandoned. And I think if we just think for a minute that the regulators adopt innovation, we might have a small problem. Our industry is accused of being conservative and slow to adapt new technology, and we found a little bit of that. So the regulators have hijacked innovation, but that's the good news. The group that we were in, we don't believe in the heavy-handed regulation. We want to encourage innovation. But the question is, do we need regulation? And I think it's self-evident that volunteerism, self-regulation isn't enough. And we wouldn't be talking about scrubbers and we wouldn't be talking about decarbonization if someone didn't set the standards, set public interests and put that first. But what can we do to improve or exceed the standard? What happens at the IMO is we negotiate and we set the lowest level of what could be commonly agreed. And that creates a lot of problems often. So in encouraging innovation, I want to borrow something that I heard this week. If Bob Burke's still in the audience, he called it the second mouse theory. The second mouse gets the cheese, and we need to stop that. We want to reward the first movers, encourage the innovation through the rewards. And if you're not able to achieve 100% of the ballast water standard, don't punish those that were early adopters of ballast water technology. Allow them to use those systems while technology advanced itself. The other thing that we learned this morning was the idea of the pre-mortem. We call this impact analysis. There's a lot of unintended consequences of the regulations that we have developed over time. If we talk about NOx and SOx and carbon, these compete with each other. So by reducing sulfur, we're actually increasing carbon. So we need a holistic approach to the regulatory process and really spend more time understanding what the negative impact could be with this holistic and pre-foreseen process. Regulations should be cost-effective. Regulations should have an expiry, or at least have some type of mandatory revalidation. If there's not that pressure to review and understand whether or not regulations that were made decades ago are still necessary, they should be expired. Finally, we talked about the timeliness and certainty of regulation. We've seen it with ballast water most recently. It took a very long time to get the convention ratified, and that created a lot of uncertainty, and that really punished innovation, that punished first movers, and I think it punished those that are affected by the invasive species that we were trying to prevent. How am I on time?
You are good. So thank you. Fantastic. Thank you. Great. Well, I'm going to suggest we do, after regulation, we do safety, and then we do the innovative financing, and then we group all the data, digitization ones together so that we can talk about some of the future innovations.
So, Gillian, I'm going to need a couple of more minutes because safety is that important.
Okay,
just
well,
look
cool.
around the room at each other. This is the number of people that we kill every year. Just think about the impact if you did not get home to your family tonight, tomorrow. Think of the impact on your spouses, on your children. That's the impact that we give to our seafarers. I'd like to suggest to the Global Maritime Forum that they make safety part of their DNA. At the opening session, nobody mentioned safety. No one in this room has had a safety briefing of how we get out if there is an incident. And by the way, the exit doors are locked. You can open them by pushing a button, but how do we know when we push that button that the doors will open? I want to talk about together in safety. The ambition is a zero accident industry. One human life lost is one too many, and safe companies are great companies. So we're going to bring together the industry. By the way, this is not a new group, and it costs you nothing. In fact, it's going to save you a lot of money. So we're bringing together the International Chamber of Shipping, BIMCO, Intertanko, Intercargo, the Cruise Liner International Association, World Shipping Council, International Group, and others. When I was presenting, other people were coming up to me and saying, please, can I be part of this, Danish Shipping Authority and the flags, Liberia, etc. We're going to include shipping companies, shipping manager representations, one overarching group with a common purpose aligned around safety. Key areas are going to be around collaboration, sharing, free flow of information, ideas, and data. It's not an NGO, as I say, no additional cost. The impact is going to impact every single one of the other groups that have spoken today. It will not only reduce accidents, it will improve the image of the industry, it'll improve efficiency, attract talent, attract capital, reduce insurance premiums. And we set a target to reduce, in the next 5 years, the number of serious accidents by 30%, and in the next 10 years by 50%, and we think that is achievable. The key principles are we're not going to reinvent the wheel, best practices. We're going to use the same language, standardize, we're going to use technology. We can't mandate, but we can learn from each other. We're going to move towards a first meeting. Between now and year end is preparation. We're going to have one-to-one meetings and some informal meetings. We're going to get alignment. And then towards the end of the Q1 next year, we're going to have the first meeting where we're going to get everyone prepared, sign off definitions, scope, and get really into the first best practices, how to operationalize it, and some of the issues. We've talked already about some of the key action areas around leadership. Your actions count more than you think. Responsibility, We can't leave this to someone else because there is nobody else. And collaboration. Together we can do so much, and alone we can do so little. We're going to be one team. We've got the power to make this happen, the most important item on our agenda. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that very rousing call to arms. And, you know, certainly, again, you've given some very concrete plans and deadlines and numbers. So that's very encouraging. I'm going to turn to the financing side of things. No? Okay, financing. Who is financing? Okay, all right. Okay, the financiers were trying to run away. Okay, okay, innovative financing. The floor is yours.
I was just chosen just right now, so therefore I'm just jumping on the stage here. So Roland Land, KfW IPEX, we are just a pure senior lender to the industry with a big portfolio. So we're talking about innovative financing. As a senior lender, it's a bit tough to talk about that. But I think we, in our group, we identified three big issues. The traditional ship lending banks are retracting, as everybody knows. Then we also have what we have seen in all the other teams, that new technology needs to be financed somehow. And the other issue is that there is still a lot of imbalances caused by state aid for the yards. So, and it's basically two topics. It's innovative financing, but also financing innovation, and it's somehow tied together. What we have seen is you have to be much more innovative in finding good financing solutions. One big cause right now is why you don't, or why banks are retracting and banks are getting less into the shipping is there is not enough transparency so far. So also here, like we were talking about the banks this morning, the Poseidon principles and all this kind of stuff, that the banks need to be more transparent. So do the ship owners and the charterers. There has to be more transparency in the game so that you can really assess the risks and then basically build on assessing the risks, innovative financing solutions, which basically tap on various sources of capital and debt. And if you have the full information on how the ship owner is operating, also with a long track record, you can easily and much easier create innovative financing solutions. Then also, if you have transparency, the big ship owners who are transparent, or also niche players which are transparent, it's much easier to finance new technology on a corporate basis with those ship owners. So you can foster this as well by having more transparency. Or we had also the idea in the team then that, for example, even going to crowdfunding, that you go to the millennials, that they invest not purely on pure risk return requirements, but also making the world somehow better. And the third big source of financing new technology, of course, are the governments. So because in order to kickstart, we have seen it with the aviation industry and the military spending in the early ages, the governments can do much in order to jumpstart new technologies. They have to take the risk, the early technology risk, in order to get it into the industry and in order to get it into the market. And then combining with the third issue, we saw that the state aid goes a lot into the yards. Why not diverting some of those funds into funding new technology and putting them to a good use in order to drive new propulsion systems, new fuel systems, and all this kind of stuff, and getting the money to a good use. These were basically the results of our team.
Thank you. Thank you, that was terrific. And again, you hit almost exactly 3 minutes, so we're doing very well indeed. All right, we've touched on a lot of themes. I wanted to end talking about the one topic which actually spawned 4 different panels, because it very much is the topic of the moment, of the future. It's a topic that's disrupting the industry like every other industry out there, which of course is digitization and the data economy. And we have 4 panels talking about this. You are volunteering to go first? Who would like to go first? Because we have different aspects of it, or you can all fight, or we can have wonderful transparency and vote on it.
If you have the microphone, you get to speak first.
Okay.
Simon Doughty, CEO of the Wallen Group.
We had a bit of a curveball in ours because it was a digital business model. And so it started off being a bit like an MBA class because we started talking about profitability, 10 times improvements and everything else. And as we went through this, we realized that the data that we were talking about, we as individuals wouldn't share because it was our intellectual property. It's what makes Maersk more competitive than CMA, CGM, or whatever. You're not going to share your efficiencies. You're not going to share how you make your business more profitable. If you imagine there was a global taxi forum one day, the Global Taxi Summit, they didn't come out and say, let's start with Uber. No, that was a disruptor that was coming into the marketplace. So we said, what can we as a group, and if you looked at the group, it was right across the spectrum of the maritime industry, what can we as a group get behind and do? And we turned around and went for 0 loss of ships and 0 loss of life through sharing of data. So what we're talking about there is trying to drive the rogue individuals out of our business. So we're sharing information that can be in a collective area. And on that situation, we were saying that it's very much like IATA, where they're capturing information about senior officers, about pilots, and they have teeth that actually if these people have caused an incident, they can be having their pilot's license taken away from them. We don't have that in the shipping community. Because again, just like everything else in our industry, it's very fragmented. There's a lot of systems capturing information about seafarers. It may be in the individual company, it may be with Intertanko, it may be with the country or the class. So we want to get a database that collects this information, that we share the information into it, but it has got to be very tangible. It can't be like Twitter, where you can write any information you want. You want the information about the master, the incident that has happened, possibly any training that he's had afterwards. We're not trying to stop people being seafarers. We just want to make sure that they're qualified to actually be in charge of a $50, $100 million asset. So we think we should bring together the complete body. So you'd have to have the insurance, the ship owners, you'd have to have the port authorities, the class societies and registries all coming together to put a working group there together. Shouldn't need a lot of funding to start with, because putting the database together shouldn't be that difficult. But this is just the low-hanging fruit. This is the start of where that group can then go. So they can look at other areas, whether it's a tug pilot or it's pilots that are causing a problem. So the group can then expand but drive in there to get the safety so that we take out the rogue people out of our industry.
Well, that is fascinating. Thank you. Round of applause. I wish I'd put you directly after the safety panel, but I can't coordinate everything quite right. But anyway, there we go. Right, digitization part 2.
Yeah, and I'm going to continue along the same lines. But my name is Jan Rimbo. I'm from Norden. And I think when Mr. Kitang Lim yesterday said that we should expect more changes in our industry the next 10 to 20 years than we've seen over the last 100 years, I agree with that. And I think actually digitalization, big data, artificial intelligence, whatever you call it, is going to play a very big part in that. And for some of the same reasons as we just heard, data is also increasingly becoming a competitive parameter. And therefore, in our group, we also very quickly came to the same conclusion that actually one very important area where we can work together is on safety. And we've heard all the good reasons already for why that is the case. But we also put out in our group this vision of having 0 fatalities in our industry, which I think is a very, very important ambition to work towards. And what we see today is that we have actually not a lack of data. We have a lot of data, but the data today is either not really structured in the right way, and most certainly it comes in silos. And that's also why we think strong collaboration between all the various stakeholders, class societies, P&I clubs, managers. We need to bring all this data together because we can raise our safety standards by actually using this data and learn much more quickly than what we can do individually. And what we more concretely thought of in our group was to actually let this forum take a lead on this by establishing a working group that can take the lead on this and reach out, obviously, to the rest of the industry, and quite quickly work on a scope for this collaboration, and put some pilot projects in place, to make it very concrete, and do that. Put this working group together before the end of the year. Have a pilot project online within the next 6 to 12 months, and hopefully, when we meet here next time, actually have some results from this pilot project. And I think industry collaboration through data, we see it as safety being where we start, and there are other areas, of course, that where we also can use data and work more efficiently together. That could be on efficiencies through, we have an awful lot of documentation that is analog today, and we also see a lot of potential there. But I think safety is the right place to start.
Well, thank you. There's definitely some common themes emerging here, and there's also a very impressive number of commitments and plans coming out, which is great. And I can see there's a bit of an argument here about who is going to go last, because whoever goes last will be really in the spotlight. So don't both rush at once.
Right, all right, I'll go next. And our group was digitalization and data sharing, which is basically the foundation that you have to get right before you can do all of these other marvelous things with data. And I speak as a regulator. I'm not one of the people who kills people in the industry. I clean up the mess and talk to their parents. And we've seen success in data exchange with port state control. Port state control, in my view, has been very successful, and it's been successful because we got data exchange sorted out a long time ago, and I was involved in the work at the IMO about how we actually harmonised codes and things. And it was that foundation work that actually gave us the tools that we could then go and start exchanging data, making port state control work on a regional basis, and actually starting to give people nowhere to hide. So this issue about data for us is the core foundation that we have to get right before we can build on that and get all these other good ideas working. Now, the core principles need to be having standardised data language. The data has to be trusted. We have to get security right so that people know who gets permission to access data, who can put data in, and the people who are using the data know they can trust it. And we also know that there's lots happening at the moment in the industry. There are projects. I, for example, know that the IMO is looking at this through their facilitation committee. IALA is doing a lot of work on the maritime cloud concept and maritime service portfolios. We've heard this in the last couple of days that shipping are doing things. I know that ports are coming up with trade communities systems. So how do we get all of the people in the right room to actually come up with some common industry standards so that we can agree that we can share data in the future? And that's going to be things with like incident data collection, data taxonomy systems. How are we going to get those together? The first thing we believe we need to do is identify the who's, get the right people in the room. Is it going to be the IMO? Is it going to be this forum? Is this forum going to become the IATA for the maritime industry? Who are the parties in the ecosystem for the industry that we need to get together, get them in a room, and actually start talking about how we come up with a common standard? And before we get that done, it's going to be very hard to actually set that light on the hill for where we want to get to. So thank you.
Right, well, thank you. Those are some very big questions you just threw out there, presented with very impressive modesty. But they are indeed big questions. Just before we listen to the last panel, tiny little geeky note or fact that not many of you may know. When I used to cover the financial sector, I was always struck by the fact that the roots of the word credit, as in credit markets, come from credare, which means to believe, which illustrates the fact that finance does not work unless there's some faith involved. It's not just about numbers. Who knows where the roots of the word data comes from? It's actually the passive of to give, to receive. Data comes from Latin, meaning to give and receive. And data is not just about a number. It's about creating relationships when you actually give and receive data. It's about people. So just a little interesting factoid to think about when you talk about creating data sharing groups. Okay, the last panel, Mark. The Baltic Exchange gets the last word.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, so suddenly there were a lot of people talking about digitization and the new business model. And part the way through our discussion, we suddenly actually said, do you know what? There needs to actually be a change in our industry. There needs to be a change to the mindset. Because we're talking about collecting all of this data, but actually a lot of people in this room don't even know how to manipulate that data or what are they going to do with that data. So really, one of the big starting points is understand how to use your own data. You know, understand what is out there that you can pull through the processes, you know, that you can test with it, and then from those blockchains or artificial intelligence, you say what are the areas that they'll affect inside your business. So we sort of looked at this as being a non-stop activity, and that sort of started asking questions about, you know, how can we use this, for example, with with the ship's captains, you know, sharing that information. You've got ship captains on board for 6 months, they come off, they come back on board again. You want to be able to pass on that knowledge throughout your whole organization. So if you start working out how you can use and share your own data, it gives you a better openness about possibly sharing data with other people as well. So the collaboration that some of us have been talking about, everybody keeps looking at a body to do it. You know, the Baltic, that's one of the things that we do. We're sharing data, we're collecting data, and we look and try and be in the middle of some of these things. But really, what we all need to do is decide what is common to us all. You know, we talk about the IP of the data. Once you've decided on a very base common set of data that we're all willing to share, safety is a really key one that everybody is willing to share. Then you add another one, how to clean your ship, how to maybe enter the port. And slowly, that sharing level goes up. And so we talked about this as being a mindset. And that starts not only at the top of companies. So here we're coming away and saying, yes, you know, we need to adopt or push out the sharing. It's actually got to come in at the ground as well. You've got to link this digitization with your goals. You've actually got to link the two together and say, this is a tool for us because it's about becoming more profitable. It's about pushing it up through the company. So really, it's about that communication internally as much as it is outside at the top level about trying to create those data sets, those sharing pools of information. I think as well, we still look at things in an old way in the fact that we get fixated on standardization. AI fixes a lot of this for us already. You know, even from APIs, just get an API. You know, we can have cloud sharing. We don't actually have to create this central repository. You know, but that understanding says we have to understand digital more. You know, we try and solve the problems with the information we have ourselves. So really, I think what we were talking about was a mindset and saying, do you know what, it's never ending. You reach your goal, and then you start again because it will have evolved from it. So, you know, one goal is certainly a year from now, we all have maybe gone out and employed a data leader, understand what a data scientist does, you know, really start looking at how that information can help your business. Thank you.
Well, I think the net result of these conversations is that you all now have a very long to-do list. And in the industry, you have a very long to-do list for this time next year. We are almost out of time. You were incredibly efficient at sticking to the time and getting through a lot of conversations very fast. So I'm not going to try and summarize the whole thing, but I want to leave you with just a couple of thoughts in terms of what I've heard in the last couple of days. One of the great joys about being a journalist, and before I became a journalist, I was actually trained as a cultural anthropologist, is that you are essentially paid to go out and be nosy. You're paid to go out and look at unfamiliar environments and tribes and learn about them. And as someone who's not inside the maritime industry, I must say it's been absolutely fascinating hearing you engage in this mass process of sharing or mass therapy or discussion and planning for a couple of days. And one of my first thoughts is that when you say that people outside the industry don't really know who you are, what you're talking about, and what you stand for, I would say, as one big outsider in the room, that is absolutely correct. I think, I've learned a lot just listening to you second time round, but there is an awful lot that people outside the industry just do not know about you. And so the question of how you present yourself and talk about some of the themes you discussed in the last couple of days, I think is absolutely critical going forward. The second thing I'd say, though, is that before I became a journalist, I was trained as a cultural anthropologist, and I did my PhD on the extremely exotic, geeky topic of wedding rituals in Tajikistan, which is about as geeky as anything you can think of. I challenge anyone else in the room to have done a geekier, weirder topic. In fact, I challenge most of you to even name Tajikistan, or rather point to it on a map and name its capital city. But it's actually incredibly relevant to what you're all doing right now. Because the reason I chose to study wedding rituals is that what weddings do is they assemble a scattered tribe in almost any culture. They bring that tribe together. They essentially recreate social ties because everyone sits together in a wedding or in an area for a couple of days. And they don't just recreate social ties. They don't just recreate that society physically by having babies. They also create a shared worldview, a mental map. What wedding rituals do, and I can see many of you nodding, because whatever culture you come from, you will have wedding rituals, is they force people to come together and to state through public and private rituals what their shared mental map is, what their key symbols are. And in many ways, conferences do exactly the same thing. I mean, you have been involved in the equivalent of a gigantic maritime industry wedding. Essentially, you've come together as a tribe, you've reforged your alliances, but you've also, through all these PowerPoints and presentations and wonderful cartoons, and they are amazing cartoons, and through all the drinking, you have essentially helped to reforge your shared mental map. And one of the things that's fascinating as an anthropologist is that we don't think mental maps are static. They change over time. And what really matters is not just what people talk about, it's what they don't talk about. Its social silences are really important. So as you leave today, it's worth thinking a bit about both what you've discussed and what you haven't discussed in the last couple of days, and how that's really fed into your shared mental map of where the industry is going. And one mental exercise that's very interesting to try and do is, we've talked a lot about going to 2030, which is 12 years ahead. Try for a minute just to think back for a moment and imagine where you were 12 years ago as an industry. And think about how your mental map, how your shared vision has incrementally changed. I mean, I wasn't here, obviously, 12 years ago. I did take part 2 years ago. I'm very struck by a number of themes that have come up this year. I mean, I'm very struck by the degree to which people are talking a lot in very tangible, practical terms about sustainability and the environment issues. That is something which I would bet quite a lot of money on has changed in terms of your shared mental map and discussions about what is or is not on the agenda. I'm very struck, obviously, by the digitization question and how that's potentially upending a lot of your business models. I'm very struck by the fact that you're looking a lot to other industries for lessons about what you can and can't do in that respect. But I'm also very struck by your attitude towards government and governing bodies. Because as someone whose job is to poke my nose into lots of other business sectors, in many parts of the business world, there's still an attitude that the government's kind of here and tells us what to do, or there's regulatory bodies that impose regulations on us. What's come out very clearly from the last couple of days of discussion is that you're trying to work as a group with different stakeholders. I mean, horrible word, but it's kind of true. You're trying to work to actually feel your way towards collective solutions and collaborative solutions before you have things done to you too soon. And the other thing that's come out is that this isn't just collaboration in a general sense. You're actually trying to draw up a very long to-do list. And almost every single one of the presentations that we just had has come out with very specific targets. And frankly, that's pretty impressive. So I'm going to hand over to Peter in just a second, but before I do, as the one real outsider in the room, not quite a millennial, but hey, I am an outsider, I would urge you to think about how you present your story to the outside world. And also, as you actually go through these very tangible targets, think about how you communicate that too. Because what you're doing is impressive, given that you have been historically so fragmented. It's quite a change in the worldview. And last but not least, I'll just say thank you for tolerating me as an insider-outsider, an ignorant outsider here for the last couple of days. And from the bottom of my heart, I say very best of luck in turning these very ambitious goals into tangible actions. And I just hope that the decarbonization letter is one model of what you guys can actually do, and girls. So thank you, and over to Peter.